leaders of France, Germany, Italy and Romania have ended their meeting in Kyiv today, assuring the Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky of firm international support. Visiting Kyiv today are the French President Emmanuel Macron, German Chancellor Olaf Scholz and Italian Prime Minister Mario Draghi. They were joined later by the Romanian President Klaus Iohannis. All four arrived this morning to Kyiv. The leaders of France, Germany and Italy arrived in Ukraine for a joint visit, as a senior Russian official voiced concern that such a move may not help solve the ongoing conflict if the trip was based on what he called a pre-written script. As they visited the town of Irpin, they were shown gutted, burnt-out buildings and the wreckage of a car which Ukraine says was targeted by Russian troops when a mother and children were inside. Irpin, a town at the northeast of the capital, Kyiv, was devastated early in the war, where withdrawing Russian forces once left behind bodies littering the streets. The visit had taken weeks to organize, while the three most powerful EU leaders all fended off criticism over positions described as too differential to Russian President Vladimir Putin. Still, the move by the three to travel together held strong symbolism at a pivotal moment. A day before, the EU's Executive Commission is expected to recommend pushing forward with Ukraine's bid to join the bloc, which EU leaders are expected to endorse at a summit next week. While in Irpin, President Emmanuel Macron said massacres and war crimes had been committed in the Ukrainian town and that it would be best to really build fast through partnership with European members. German Chancellor Olaf Scholz said Irpin, like Bucha, had become a symbol of terrible and senseless destruction, as innocent lives had been targeted, houses had been destroyed, and an entire city had been destroyed where there was no military infrastructure at all. Joined later by the Romanian President Klaus Iohannis, they engaged in deeper discussion with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky. President Zelensky said Russia's invasion amounted to aggression against all of Europe, and that the more weapons Ukraine gets from Western nations, the faster it will be able to liberate its occupied lands. He also talked about the prospect of further sanctions against Moscow. The Kremlin, aware of the visit, had said earlier it hoped leaders would use their visit to Kyiv to discuss other subjects than the supply of weapons to Ukraine. Kremlin spokesperson Dmitry Peskov said in a call with reporters that they should use their time with President Zelensky to take a realistic look at the state of affairs. Now, NATO defense ministers are also meeting for a second day in Brussels to discuss the situation in Ukraine and a Latvian request for more troops 2 weeks before NATO leaders are set to decide the future military lineup on the alliance's eastern flank in response to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And before the meeting, Latvian Defense Minister Artis Fabriks called for larger forces in the Baltic states and said that any sign of weakness, be it in Ukraine or on NATO territory, would encourage Russia. Estonia and Lithuania support Latvia's position. Now, immediately after Russia's invasion of Ukraine in February, NATO dispatched additional troops, ships and jets to the alliance's eastern front, in particular to the Baltics, and placed some 40,000 troops under direct NATO command. NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg expressed his support for the security body, increasing its military capabilities on the group's eastern flank.
If we would act correctly in 2014, there would not be 2022. So will we act now correctly in order to avoid the next war? That's a big question. And that basically means that we need a prepositioning of larger armed forces in such countries as the Baltic states. There must be weapons. There must be economic might of the West put behind Ukraine, because Ukraine must win. It's very simple. And Russia must lose. There's no other way out of this.
About a Georgian war in 2008.
Well, joining me now is a foreign affairs commentator, Collins Weke. He's in Brussels. So, Collins, thank you for joining me on the program. And I'm sure that you're watching these meetings going on. Well, first of all, let's talk about the one in Ukraine, where the French president, Emmanuel Macron, the Romanian president, Klaus Lohannis, as well as the German Chancellor Olaf Scholz and the Italian Prime Minister Mario Draghi all attended with the Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky. What do you make of the last-minute rally of support around Ukraine at this time?
Thank you, Amarachi, for having me. Well, the rallying of support has always been there from day one, so we need to get that very clear. So it is a continuation of that policy of the Western Alliance to actually stand very firmly behind Ukraine. You can, however, say that the German Chancellor and the French President have lately been under very heavy criticisms for not making this trip earlier than today. So to that extent, of course, you could actually surmise that there is a bit of domestic political pressure on their part to make the trip. However, looking at the contents of their discussions and the pronouncements that they have made so far, I think it is fair to infer that this is not a meeting or a trip that was hurriedly put together. There are some plans behind it, and ultimately, I believe that the cardinal point to be made here is that the three EU leaders, including Romania, making it 4, actually are continuing that Western Alliance campaign of ensuring that Russia loses and that Ukraine wins this war.
And it's a very interesting dynamic that we're seeing, in the recent times. And the Ukrainian president has called out, the two leaders that you mentioned, Olaf Scholz and Emmanuel Macron, for their support also for Russia. I mean, how do they balance that, with promising the Ukrainian president of their financial support, of military aid and all of that? How do they balance that, with their relations with Russia?
I would want to think that the German Chancellor and the French President are rather being diplomatic in their approach. Now, calling their relationship with Russian President as a show of support, I don't quite think that there is enough evidence to support such assertion. Now, what you could say at best is that they may be playing the good cop and the bad cop, strategy, where they are desirous of keeping an open door with Russia, not to give up completely on Russia, to create the impression, of course, that Russia has in them a negotiating partner. So that ultimately they are looking at the long-term goal, which is to end this war. And indeed, the war is not going to end under the barrels of the gun. It is going to end on a negotiating table. And so, giving the assurances, directly or indirectly to Russia, that there will be a soft landing for him when he decides to, give up the arms, and better giving it up as quickly as possible. They believe that it is something that will encourage him. But of course, the interpretation is different.
Yeah, and I remember the early days, of this Russian invasion of Ukraine. The French President Emmanuel Macron paid a visit to the Russian president. I think this was a few days before the invasion, and he got assurances from the Russian president, of not invading Ukraine, having no intentions of doing that. Of course, that has changed now. But the Russian government is monitoring this meeting going on between the leaders. Earlier they had said, they should focus on other things, than providing weapons, more weapons for Ukraine. Do you think there's a threat in that advice that Russia may be given to these European leaders?
Well, obviously, Russian President Vladimir Putin is not going to be smiling, at the German Chancellor or the French President for this trip that they have made. But I think it will surprise any watcher if indeed the two, EU leaders, France and Germany are expecting a smile from Vladimir Putin because there is enough blame to go around. Like you mentioned, Putin denied up until the last minute that he is planning to invade Ukraine. And even at that, he is still in denial. He hasn't called this a war. He continues to call it officially a special operation. So he is deceiving, the other people. So I don't think this will surprise him. Now, coming to the Russian leaders' request for them to stop supplying arms to Ukraine, well, of course, it's expected to say that because he wants, an easy run over of Ukraine. But short of direct combat with Russia from the NATO alliance, they are actually, fueling this or supporting Ukraine indirectly by the supply of arms. They are left with no other option than to continue along that line. You are probably aware that, just yesterday, a vote of $1 billion, US dollars has been made to Ukraine to support them in purchase of, armored vehicles and the rest of them. So, yeah, it's continuing, and it doesn't look like Russia can do anything about it.
It's interesting, that Russia sees this as a provocation. More weapons for Ukraine, and that $1 billion military assistance the U.S. will be providing, additional military assistance U.S. will be providing for Ukraine. But NATO defense ministers are also meeting where you are, in your city, Brussels. I'm sure that there's a lot of activity going on there. The plan, of course, is, to show some sort of solidarity with Ukraine. And I know that individually, some of these countries have, pledged support, financial and military, towards Ukraine. But how much effort do you think they're making diplomatically to help stop this war?
Well, that's a very interesting question. And you can actually draw a correlation between the NATO activities by way of military support and the position that the German Chancellor and the French President have taken. So, to a very large extent, you can actually assert that the diplomatic channel is held open and alive and kicking via these two leaders by trying to maintain a warm relationship with Russia. Now, that's on the one hand. Now, on the other hand, and tied to the diplomatic side of things, I believe that the Western Alliance have done nothing than support the negotiations that are taking place in neutral grounds, Poland, Hungary, and all of that. Despite the dilly-dallying of the Russian leader, they have, continued to have faith in the efficacy of diplomacy, and they continue to, support the initiative. Well, I think people could look at this, ordinary mortals like you and I could look at this and say, well, there seems to be some sort of a double standard here. How could you be, supporting diplomatic channels, yet you are supplying arms and actually, making some economic enhancement, initiative towards Ukraine? Well, those are two separate matters. The fact of the matter is that the war is ongoing, and in their books, Russia has got to lose and Ukraine would have to win. And one way to do that is to support them militarily and financially until, the guns go silent.
I think it's safe to say at this time that NATO and other EU countries are fighting this war by proxy, by providing those weapons to Ukraine. But the Ukrainian government is trying as hard as it can, to maintain courage, to keep up the courage that the troops have, those who are facing the Russian forces at the forefront. But, a lot of bombardments coming from the Russian forces and from the Russian military. And it's really heartbreaking to see the pictures, the destruction that has happened in Ukraine. And at the end of the day, we'll all sit down and count the losses, the human lives that have been lost, and also the infrastructure that's also been lost. But, Ukraine loses the most in this. So what else can leaders do, to stop this as soon as possible so that, we don't have to count, more than necessary what has been lost in the war?
Yeah, what else they can do is nothing other than, pursuing vigorously and unrelentingly the diplomatic channel, because it is only through that means that this war is going to end. However, like you were aptly captured, Ukraine is under heavy bombardment. Infrastructure is actually being demolished like it's no one's business. The human cost of, the invasion is very, very high. As a matter of fact, Europe has also been very, very, accommodating, because obviously Ukrainians have managed to find their ways into various cities of Europe. So one way that Europe believes that they will actually, scale down on the extent of devastation, infrastructural devastation, is indeed to supply Ukraine the arms that they need to defend themselves, and also to carry out some preemptive, operations, so that in the end, the losses will be, limited, and the rebuilding, which they are already talking about, which is part of, building the hope for Ukraine, will actually be at the, reduced to the barest minimum. But yeah, the toll is high, and the rebuilding will, take care of all of that.
Yeah, and I think probably that's where, the focus should be on now, the rebuilding. Lots of beautiful cities destroyed in Ukraine by Russia, and some on the side of Russia blame Ukraine for what's going on. I've spoken to analysts who say that all of this could have been stopped, really. I mean, it was in Ukraine's hands to stop this war in the first place. Colin Smeke, it's been a real pleasure speaking with you. Thank you for joining me today on the program.
A pleasure, Amarex. Thank you for having me.
China has always stood on the side of peace and justice over the Ukrainian issue, and independently assessed the situation on the basis of the historical context of the merits of the issue. That's according to Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesperson Wang Wenbin earlier today. Now, his remarks come after a U.S. State Department spokesperson said China risked ending up on the wrong side of history over the Ukrainian issue. Wang said that China has always stood on the right side of peace and justice, and lashed out at the United States' incitement to the conflict. According to Wenbin, while the United States broke its commitments and continuously pushed the eastward expansion of NATO that brought Europe to fall into conflict and confrontation again, China actively advocated a concept of common, comprehensive, cooperative and sustainable security, and called for the establishment of a balanced, effective and sustainable European security architecture. While the United States clamored to fight until the last Ukrainian and fueled the crisis or the conflict, China actively urged for peace talks and pointed out that the international community should support Russia and Ukraine to continue talks, not fighting.